through the ages. Introduction, what is art history? This is a painting by Claude Lorrain. It was created in 1684. Do you know what time period that is? The title of the piece is Embarkation of the Queen of Sheba. This is an oil on canvas, and this particular painting is 4 feet 10 inches by 6 feet 4 inches and is currently in the National Gallery of Art in London. What do you see happening in the piece? What do you think this means? Where is this painting? Would you have guessed that this is a biblical scene that is now taking place in early Greek art? How does that make sense? What do you suppose that Claude Lorrain was trying to say? Today, viewers of art often come to a painting with their own experiences, and they use this to interpret what the piece means. So both art in the past and the present today are in art museums. That is a new creation for today's viewers. In the past, art was not placed all over the world in museums for people to see. Today, artwork includes canvas, ancient art, and art from other cultures. Viewers can go into a museum and react to art without any knowledge of the circumstances of its creation. Perhaps that is some of the most important interpretation according to new theories of art and art interpretation. Viewers then can react to what they see and interpret art according to their own experiences. Perhaps your experiences are then closer to what the artist meant in its intent. We also judge it as a success or failure. Is this good art? Why? Is this bad art? Why? All right, remember the Claude Lorrain? Why does this building look natural when the top of the building lines of this building are not parallel? Aren't all buildings parallel? Notice how it is angling down. Remember when I said that this was a French painter from the 17th century, and yet he painted a biblical story in a contemporary harbor with a Roman ruin? What do you suppose he was trying to say? Along with the building being slanted, you also noted that their boats in the foreground are much bigger than the sailing ship is in the background. What do you suppose that's all about? All right, let's start by looking at this painting by Clyfford Still called 1948 C. It's an oil on canvas. Today, any artist who's making work does not think it's going to end up in a museum. Maybe he hopes it is. He doesn't know where it's going to end up. Often contemporary artists work in private studios and sell their work into galleries. Clyfford Still created this series of pure color paintings and titled each with the year of their creation. However, in the past, most art was created for some purpose or for some specific patron. Often that person was of royalty or it was for religious use. Today, art history's goal is to determine as close as possible the context of the art, the circumstances surrounding an artwork, and the patronage or the place for which it was created, and an understanding of the history and the people involved. Clyfford Still was among the first generation of abstract expressionists, and they developed a powerful approach to painting over the years following World War II. But there was a lot of artwork that was made prior to World War II between the wars, which allowed people to paint in this bold, non-representational style. So to get there, and to understand what you're going to be studying this semester, I want you to think like an art historian. So here are the questions an art historian asks. First of all, how old is it? Was it made last year or was it made many, many thousands of years ago? What style is it? Is this a personal style? Is it a regional style? Do you know what that means? What subject is it? Or what is this painting about? Would you have guessed that Claude Lorrain was a religious biblical piece? Why do you suppose they made it with Greek ruins in the background? And who was it made for? Do you think it was made for a church since it was a biblical scene? And if that's the case, who paid for it? Was it the church that paid for it? What does it look like? What is going on? Why are those boats bigger in the foreground than in the background? And what does that mean? How was it made? It said it was oil paint. What other materials was there, if any? And what techniques were used? Is it bold and abstract like Clifford Stills, or was it in a more realistic style? And finally, what elements and principles of design were used? What terminology are we going to use to talk about this piece? All right, so we're starting here in the 20th century, and we're not sure what art is anymore. The study of visual and tangible objects that mankind makes and build in the 20th century, and that's art. So we start by classification of art. We have architecture, we have sculpture, we have anything that's pictorial like painting, drawing, printmaking, photography, digital art. We have craft or arts of design. In other words, utilitarian objects such as ceramics, metalwork, textiles, jewelry, clothing. And then we have blurring of categories in art. Does a pictorial piece have a ceramic element to it? Is that possible? Or can you paint a painting on a piece of ceramic that is a utilitarian vessel? We also have lots and lots of new media. New types of media are being generated every day, including all kinds of digital arts and games. Do they fall in the same category as something that's painted? And we also have performance art. Because there's so many different kinds of classification of art, it brings us up to a classification dispute. A classification dispute is a discussion or a debate about whether or not an object is truly art, or if it's either restrictive or expansive. The example is below. I think you've probably been looking at it with people walking around a straw box in the middle of a museum. That's not the only unbelievable and strange looking things that we see in museums today. The first question that art historians ask is, how old is it? What is its historical chronology? We have to take in consideration any physical evidence and materials that are available in certain times and places. And often over the years, this physical evidence and our knowledge of that physical evidence changes. The documentary evidence or dated work or documents, and what is it about? The internal evidence, such as hairstyles, clothing, and furniture use. The stylistic evidence, or the artistic manner or artists in an individualized way of creating art. All of those things we're going to look at a piece and try to interpretate when it was made, how old it is. How old is it actually? Many people will be forgiven for thinking that Australian has some of the oldest rock art in the world, but the truth is that there is no reliable dating to show this. Rocks bearing Aboriginal engravings on the Burrup Peninsula have the potential to preserve their engravings for 50,000 to 60,000 years, but they have done no direct dating of the engravings itself. The ochre paintings of a giant emu-like bird could be 40,000 years old, as old as the paintings in Spain and Indonesia, but there's no datable carbon from plants, charcoal, or dust caught in those ochre pigments that they were created with. Second, what style of art is it? That also helps us date a piece. There are several different kinds of style. The first one is called period style. A period style is the characteristic manner of a specific era or span of years. A regional style is the variations tied to specific geography. Not everybody at the same time is going to be creating art that looks similar. And personal style, there are very distinctive manners of a lot of individual artists throughout history. All right, here's an example of the period style of archaic Greece versus the High Renaissance. Notice both are nude. They both have similar subject matter, but the way that the artist portrays, and they're both stone sculptures. But notice how the artist portrays the subject of the male, which is completely different from the archaic Greek to the High Renaissance. Here is another example of style. This is regional style. This is France on the left. It's the choir of the Beauvais Cathedral. And on the right is the interior of the Santa Croce in Florence. What do you notice as the difference between the two? Notice the vaulted ceilings or the arches in the ceilings on the piece on the left compared to the arches along the side on both sides, and the flat ceiling with beams across the one in the right from Florence. Here's a really good example of an artist that we can pick out her work from almost everywhere, and that's because she has a strong personal style. This is Georgia O'Keeffe. This is the Jack in the Pulpit number 4, painted in 1930. O'Keeffe painted a number of Jacks in the pulpit that became increasingly more and more abstract. She was interested in the Jack, which is this little piece here, and as she zooms in from her paintings, we see it get more and more abstract. She also has a sharply focused view of petals and leaves with powerful lines and forms and colors. Her paint is also very smoothly applied. Her colors are bright, much brighter than a lot of her contemporaries at that time. Here's a personal style of Ben Shahn. This is called The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti from 1931 to 1932. The way Shahn painted the faces is vastly different from his contemporaries. Notice the lack of realism. There's also some almost cubistic look to them. They're sad. The colors are different. The style is very personalized. The next thing that art historians look at are the subject matter. The subject matter in a story or a narrative. The difference between a story and a narrative is a story is telling what's happening. A narrative often tells something more personal. Or is it a scene? Is it an image scene in a painting? Does it show a time and a place? What persons are involved and what environment does it take place in? What kind of details do you see? Non-objective art is an abstract piece that has no subject matter at all. Often subject categories have further subdivisions. They could be religious and still have a story or a narrative. They could be historical and still have all the things on the left, time and place. They could be mythological. They could be science fiction. Are they a daily life painting or a genre painting? Is it a portrait or a still life? What do you think the subject matter of this Ben Shahn painting is? Why are all the boys facing a wall? Obviously, we can see they're playing some kind of handball. Iconography is the next thing to take into consideration. We're trying to interpret a piece of art. What is an icon? An icon is a known subject matter of that time or period that has a specific meaning that we don't have to interpret. What do you think is this big body in the middle of this piece? It has wings. These are wings. It has a halo. Does that help you guess that this is an icon that has some kind of religious significance? Here is a detail from that called the weighing of the souls. Obviously, then just the word souls makes us think it has a religious connotation. What other icons do you see? There are definitely people suffering and writhing, maybe snakes. The symbols and images that portray ideas are the icons. The cross, for example, did you even notice the cross that was in the piece? In Christian art is a crucifixion. Are there personal personification, abstract ideas in human forms? Why are those abstract ideas? Well, if it's a judgment and then there is a Trump being born here, then this is a personification of people who are being sent off to pay for their sins. Iconography and personifications. Iconography is a symbol that makes sense to us. We know that there are symbols within all the works of art, and often that changes throughout time. For example, St. Matthew was a winged man in the previous scene. John was the eagle, and Mark was a lion, and Luke was his ox. We may not understand those things, and you would have to be of a specific religion to know those meanings. This is the four evangelists from the Archaean Gospels. What clues that those are evangelists that might be out there today? We can see that there's possibly halos. We know that they're reading books. We see the eagle. Do you see Mark the lion? Do you see Luke his ox? Does that change what this means? It does to somebody if you understand those icons. But here's an icon that most of us understand, and it's the Statue of Liberty. Did you know that throughout history, the Statue of Liberty, or Liberty herself, has been a robed woman? That makes sense, right? But what is a robe and what is a lack of a robe? She's also shown with a torch in almost all Liberty scenes. And she has some kind of red crown, just like within the Statue of Liberty. And she often holds a torch to light the way. Here's another one that maybe you understand, or maybe you have a little bit more. This is the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And even without considering the style and knowing the market, viewers can determine much from the period. So there are four horsemen. There's four horses and there's four men on that. So if you know the story of the four horsemen, you could probably glean that that is part of it. There is some kind of angel in the sky. You see weapons being drawn. This first one here is death. Would you have guessed that? I think that would be a little hard to say because they're all wielding some kind of swords. There's war. Actually, this is death down here. This is famine, war, pestilence. I think the viewers of that time could make more meaning by looking at the four horsemen because they understood the iconography better. Who made it? Sometimes a group of artists work in the same style at the same time and place known as a school. For example, a Dutch school. And these three paintings are part of the Dutch school. Notice the buildings are really similar in the way that they're made it, but also the style in which the paint has been applied makes it more identifiable as the Dutch school of painting. But Ben Shaw, if he hadn't signed his paintings, an art historian, could they still attribute this piece to him based on the style? I think possibly could because of the distortion of the lines within his pieces and the distortion within his faces and figures. Who paid it? Who paid for it? All right, sometimes patronage really affects the artist. For example, Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel very specifically was told what he had to put within the piece. So many times artists create within works that have little to say about what form their works takes. If you paint something for somebody else and they want buffalo and teepees in it, you better paint buffalo and teepees in it or they're not going to buy it from you. That's the same thing as patronage. All the artists toiled in obscurity at the bidding of their patron, who employs them and decides what form it will take. So who could have paid for it? Learned monks and themes for sculptural decorations in medieval churches were then paid by the church. The Renaissance princes and the popes sometimes paid for pieces done in the Renaissance as well as the church, and they all dictated the subject, the size, and the material for its display in buildings. Patrons' contract often eliminates any personal style because they're painting it to the desired outcome for that patron. This is a bust of Augustus wearing an oak crown. It was discovered at the site of a Roman villa in France. And that was Augustus. Here's another Augustus. And see how he differs. Roman Augustus compared to this young godlike Augustus, and even this more serious Augustus. What words do art historians use? The elements and principles of design, if you studied design yet, are a lot of the words. Form is the shape and the structure. Composition is how it's organized. The material is the medium in which it was made. The techniques are the tools and the methods. Line is one of the more important elements of design. It has the path of where the eye moves. Color includes how the colors are made, including natural light, additive paint, subtractive paint, color that's absorbed by all but of one color. Primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. Secondary colors are mixed with the primaries, making yellow and red of orange, purple, and green. Complements are the colors that are opposite. The texture is a surface quality that you can feel or you can look at, and it synthesizes the feel. The space is the boundary of the actual space or the illusionary space. The mass is a 3D object in both, but there's also implied mask. The volume is the interior space of a 3D object. Perspective is the illusional space, such as one-point perspective, two-point perspective, three-point perspective, and multiple-point perspective. Remember the diagonal lines in the Claude Lorraine? That was because the artist was using perspective, a typical thing that developed in Western art during the Renaissance. Foreshortening is perspective used on people. Proportion is the relationship of size and parts. And hierarchy of scale is the enlargement of elements that are considered more important. Often scale, when we look at things, remember the big ship in the foreground and the smaller ship in the background? As we view them, things look closer are bigger and further away are smaller. This is the Homage to the Square with Rays by Joseph Albers, who is an American-born German living between 1888 and 1976. Albers often explored color relationship, and his pieces are called Homage to the Square with Rays. See all the different color relationships he explored with squares. Remember the perspective. Now you can see the Claude Lorraine painting. This one is the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba, and this is the seaport at sunset. Here is the big ship that we were talking about. The perspective is the art of drawing small, solid objects on a two-dimensional surface to give it the right impression of their height, width, depth, and position in relationship to each other when viewed from a particular point. All perspective has some kind of focal point. In Lorraine's piece, you can see that the sun becomes the focal point in both paintings. Notice the diagonal lines on the left and the diagonal lines on the right. Notice the things in the front are bigger and the things in the back are smaller. These are all ways of dealing with space. We also have closer objects being brighter and darker, and further away objects being more blurry and more cooler in color, except with the sunset, that there is some warm there, but we still have cool color. One of the things that perspective also uses via the Renaissance artists is correct value judgments, which make things look more realistic. Because we have the sun and rise and the sunset in these two pieces, then we have a lot of obvious work being done for the values of lights and darks within the image. That's not always the case with non-Western artists. They have been more interested in shape and line and color rather than realistic space, as in the ways that Matsushima, and this is in the Edo period from 17 to 76, which is at the similar time as Lorraine's. I love the blue and the gold colors within this piece. The lines of the waves are particularly interesting, the texture that they create. Still a highly original and interesting work of art, although it may not be the same as our Western look. Foreshortening for hunters and animals in this piece, and here you see a figure that's drawn with foreshortening. See how his head is bigger and his shoulders are bigger and his body goes off into space. This piece by Peter Paul Rubens has foreshortening of the figures. Here is Lion Hunt. It's about the same period of time, and you can see the tiger hunt down here, that there is foreshortening. Here's a really good example. Notice his wide shoulders and his figure going back into smaller as it goes into space. Notice the large rump of the horses and how on this piece as well. So when you recognize that, you'll know that a piece is foreshortened. But here's something that clearly does not have foreshortening to that. This is from Egypt, from a tomb at 2615 BCE, and the human form doesn't have that same kind of realistic look in space. Clearly, and there is no overlapping of one object into another object as in the Renaissance. All right, what happens when we see things where the scale doesn't quite make sense to us? And this is from the Altar of the Hand. It's 18th century Nigeria. And in this particular piece, it's a hierarchy of scale. So things that are bigger are more important than the things that are smaller. So I would say, knowing that this particular person is the most important person in the whole entire piece because he is the big piece. Here is a Michelangelo, one of his carved sculptures. And how do you suppose he made this? He didn't take a bunch of clay and squish it together and come with this particular piece. It says it's carved, but there are a lot of hints that show it's carved. Thus, the rough rock that we see around the outside still looks like rock. It's known as a subtractive process, that Michelangelo took a gigantic hunk of rock and carved his people into it. This is Atlas' slave. He is named after Atlas, who carried the entire world on his shoulders. That's why Michelangelo probably left the sculpture in its rough hewn form that you see here, but you still know the beautiful form of the human being holding up the rock. Here is another form, and see how different it is in style from Michelangelo. And yet it's far earlier than that. This is from Italy and 460 to 450 BCE. Here is the head of the warrior. Notice all the different curls of the carved sculpture. It is cast. It's made out of bronze. It's then called an additive sculpture, and then it's welded together. All right, here's another way that we will be looking at artworks. Here is a cathedral from France, rebuilt in 1284. Here are the plans. And one other way, and the reason why I'm showing you this is John Henry Sylvester, and it is the portrait of Tai Fei Koop and his self-portrait. So he actually had all of the tattoos on his face, and you can see what other artists did, and then this is his self-portrait there. So take in consideration of all the different ways that we are going to be looking at art this semester and art in the future.